Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me as always is Laura.
Rick, today we are going to dig into a story that I think is one of the most consequential, quietly unfolding stories of the entire AI year, and it is the Huawei Ascend 950 PR situation in China.
Set the scene for me because I have been hearing chatter about Huawei's chip ramp for many months now, but the recent reporting feels like it has accelerated to a meaningfully different level of seriousness.
So the headline number, and this is the one that just stops you cold when you read it, is that ByteDance alone has committed $5.6 billion to a single Huawei Ascend 950 PR purchase order this year.
$5.6 billion from one company is the kind of figure that used to be reserved exclusively for orders going to Nvidia. So seeing that number flow toward Huawei tells you something fundamental has changed in the Chinese market.
Exactly. And ByteDance is not alone in this rush, because Alibaba Cloud and Tencent have placed significant orders too, with the total committed procurement now well above 500,000 units across just those three Chinese hyperscalers combined.
Now help me put that in context, because 500,000 accelerators is a serious deployment scale, even by the wild standards of the current global AI infrastructure build-out that we keep covering on this show.
To put it in scale, Huawei is now targeting roughly 750,000 units of the 950 PR shipped this year, with mass production starting in April and full-scale shipments arriving in the second half of 2026.
That production cadence is interesting because Huawei has historically been bottlenecked by access to leading-edge process nodes. So the question becomes whether this volume target is actually achievable or whether it slips later in the year.
That is the real question, because demand is clearly running hotter than supply, with industry sources suggesting total Chinese hyperscaler demand for Ascend chips could reach $12 to $15 billion in 2026.
12 to $15 billion is genuinely Nvidia level money flowing into a domestic Chinese alternative, which feels like a structural shift rather than a temporary quirk driven by one good chip launch and a friendly customer or two.
And the catalyst that flipped this from a slow simmer into a buying frenzy was DeepSeek Vi 4 launching in late April, because DeepSeek explicitly optimized its newest flagship model for Huawei's Ascend 950 series silicon.
That is a fascinating coupling because it means the model release and the chip ramp are now reinforcing each other, with the software ecosystem dragging the hardware adoption curve forward instead of the other way around for once.
Right, and within days of the V4 launch, ByteDance, Tencent, and Alibaba all reopened conversations with Huawei about fresh orders, while cloud and GPU rental operators were urgently pushing to get added to the allocation list.
Walk me through the technical side, because the specifications really matter for understanding whether this is a serious Nvidia competitor on the merits or whether it is a workable substitute that mostly benefits from political tailwinds and export controls.
Sure, the headline performance number is that the 950 PR delivers approximately 2.8 times the FP4 performance of Nvidia's H20 at a $16,000 price point per chip.
2.8 times the H20 at that price is genuinely competitive on raw throughput. And remember, the H20 is the export-controlled chip Nvidia was selling into China before the rules tightened even further this year.
Exactly, and there are different SKUs in play, with the base version expected to sell for around $7,200 and a premium high-bandwidth memory version coming in at roughly $10,000 per unit.
Those price points really matter because total cost of ownership is what actually determines hyperscaler purchasing decisions. And Huawei is now competitive enough on dollars per flop to win on pure economics, not just on politics.
But the truly disruptive element, and this is the thing that I think is being underappreciated in much of the mainstream coverage, is that the 950 PR ships with a fully CUDA compatible software stack out of the box.
Now, that is the detail that genuinely changes the strategic calculus, because NVIDIA's moat for the past decade has not been raw silicon performance. It has been the CUDA software ecosystem that everyone in AI builds against.
Exactly. CUDA compatibility means Chinese AI labs and cloud operators can lift their existing model training and inference code with minimal porting work, which dramatically lowers the switching cost from Nvidia accelerators to Huawei accelerators.
Historically, vendors who tried to clone or compete with CUDA, whether AMD with ROCm or various startups with their own custom tool chains, struggled because porting friction kept developers stuck on Nvidia even when alternatives looked cheaper on paper.
And by approaching this from the CUDA compatibility angle, rather than asking developers to learn an entirely new framework from scratch, Huawei has neutralized the single biggest defensive asset Nvidia has been counting on for years to retain its customers.
This raises a fascinating question about Nvidia's strategic response, because they cannot easily ship into China at the leading edge anymore due to export controls, which means they may simply forfeit this entire segment of the global market.
Nvidia's China revenue has been declining for several quarters and is expected to keep declining, with some market estimates now suggesting Huawei's share of the domestic AI accelerator market could reach 60% by the end of the year.
60% domestic market share for Huawei would be a complete reversal from the situation just 2 years ago, when Nvidia controlled essentially the entire high-end Chinese AI training market with very little real competition.
And this is happening even as Nvidia's overall global business is booming because the Vera Rubin platform is ramping in the US and Europe, which means the geographic split of Nvidia's revenue base is fundamentally changing in real time.
That geographic reshaping has long-term implications because the Chinese AI ecosystem is now developing with its own supply chain, its own dominant chip vendor, and its own optimized model architectures, increasingly independent of Western infrastructure.
Right, and that is exactly the framing the Chinese government has been pushing through industrial policy for years. But it took the combination of export controls and a credible domestic alternative to actually make that vision real.
Talk to me about manufacturing constraints, because Huawei is producing this chip on Chinese fab capacity, which has historically been a couple of generations behind TSMC. So how are they pulling competitive performance out of older nodes anyway?
That is a genuinely good question, and the answer involves a combination of architectural cleverness, very aggressive memory bandwidth integration with HBM stacks, and SMIC's continued progress on advanced nodes despite international restrictions on equipment imports into China.
SMIC has been an underrated story in all of this, because much of the conversation has focused on the chip designers like Huawei, when actually the foundry capability is the more constrained variable in the entire supply chain right now.
Absolutely. And SMIC has reportedly been ramping 7 nanometer and even 5 nanometer equivalent processes, despite not having access to extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is a remarkable engineering achievement given the constraints they are operating under right now.
Let us pivot to what this means for the broader global AI ecosystem, because if China genuinely achieves AI compute sovereignty, the global dynamics around model training, model deployment, and AI policy all shift significantly in unexpected directions.
One immediate implication is that Chinese AI labs will train and deploy at increasing scale without depending on any Western infrastructure, which dramatically changes the regulatory leverage that the United States has been wielding through export controls.
That regulatory leverage was a centerpiece of U.S. AI policy for the past 3 years, with the assumption being that compute access could be used to shape Chinese AI development in directions that Washington preferred for security reasons.
And if that assumption breaks down because China has its own credible compute path, then U.S. policymakers have to rethink the entire premise of compute-centric AI containment, which has implications for everything from chip export rules to allied diplomacy.
There is also a scientific and economic implication, because if Chinese labs can train frontier models on domestic chips without restriction, the global pace of AI progress accelerates, because there are now genuinely 2 parallel competitive ecosystems instead of one dominant one.
And we are already seeing that with DeepSeek 5.4, which arguably has best-in-class price performance among open-weight models. And the success of that model is partially what gave Huawei the validation it needed to scale chip orders.
That is the flywheel I want listeners to really internalize, because once a chip plus model plus deployment loop forms locally inside an ecosystem, it self-reinforces and becomes very hard to disrupt from outside that ecosystem.
For Western enterprises and developers, the practical question becomes whether to bet on the Western NVIDIA-centric stack exclusively going forward, or to also support deployment paths that work on the increasingly capable Chinese alternative ecosystem too.
That decision is going to get harder as the Chinese AI ecosystem matures further, especially for any company that has meaningful Chinese revenue or operations, because they may face pressure from local regulators to deploy on domestic infrastructure increasingly.
And it is worth noting how quickly this has shifted, because just 12 months ago, the conventional wisdom was that Huawei was years behind, and that export controls would maintain a persistent gap that would only widen over time naturally.
That conventional wisdom has been demolished in roughly 4 quarters, which is a real lesson in how fast technology trajectories can change when industrial policy, market demand, and engineering progress all align in the same direction at once.
I think the lesson for our listeners is to take Chinese AI capability seriously, both as a competitive force in the market and as a research frontier in its own right, because the assumption that the West will lead by default is no longer safe.
And the corollary to that takeaway is to watch the next generation of Huawei chips closely, because if the 950 PR is this competitive already, the 960 and beyond series could close even more of the gap with Nvidia silicon.
Huawei has already publicly teased a 960 series for late 2026 and into 2027, with claimed performance improvements that would put it within striking distance of Nvidia's Vera Rubin tier accelerators on paper at least.
If that lands as advertised on time, then the Chinese AI ecosystem will have a domestic frontier chip alternative at roughly the same generation as the leading Western chip, which would be a true watershed moment for global AI competition.
For now, though, the story is the 950 PR ramp, the $5.6 billion ByteDance commitment, and the rapidly forming Chinese AI compute supply chain that no longer needs anything from outside its own borders to function.
Big picture, this is a story about industrial policy, export control, unintended consequences, and software ecosystem strategy, all colliding in a chip launch that quietly may end up being one of the most consequential events of the entire AI year.
And we will keep tracking it on the show because the fallout, both for NVIDIA's China revenue trajectory and for the competitive landscape and foundation models globally, is going to be unfolding for many quarters to come from here.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.